What's up everyone, Developer Gus here. Today we're going to get you set up with CSS and HTML files so you can start building some thick websites. No fluff, just the good stuff you actually need to know. Alright, first things first, we need somewhere to put all our code. I'm using VS Code or Visual Studio Code, but honestly, use whatever editor that makes you happy. You can use Notepad++ or Sublime Text. So the steps are pretty much the same everywhere. Here's what we're going to do. So the first step is to make our main folder. Now in Visual Studio Code, so you open your Visual Studio Code editor or whatever code editor you want. I'm going to create a new folder called CSS-practice or whatever you want to call it. I'm not your boss. This is going to be your home base for everything. Step 2 is to add the CSS folder. So inside of your main folder, make another folder called CSS. In that CSS folder, create a file called styles.css. Styles.css. This is where all your styling is going to be added. Step 3 is to create your HTML file. So back in CSS practice, in this folder, we're going to create a file called index.html. Okay, so inside of the CSS practice folder, we have a CSS folder. Inside of the CSS practice folder, we have the index.html. Inside of the CSS folder, we have the styles.css file. Okay, so the next step, so the index.html is going to be your web page. Inside of the CSS folder is the styles.css file. In this file, we're going to add all our styling. Okay. So the next step is to link those two together. We want to link the styles.css file to our home page, which is going to be the index.html file. So once index.html is open, I'm going to add a line of code called link tag with the following attributes. Just like that. Okay, so this is basically, ignore this, this is from GitHub Copilot, an extension. So this line of code is basically telling your HTML, hey, go grab that CSS file, which is called styles.css, and use it. Okay, we're going to make another folder. This is the fifth step. We're going to create an images folder of the main directory. We're just going to call it images, and this is where we're going to add all our images. So now you have a CSS folder with the styles.css file, an images folder which is empty for now, and then index.html file. This is going to be the home page. So it's a pretty easy to set up folder structure. So now let's write some actual CSS. So let's make something happen to the on screen. We're going to open that styles.css file. I'm going to write h1 to select all the h1 tag, with this property, I'm selecting, or this selector, excuse me, we're selecting all the headings that are of type h1. So if I were to write h1 right here like this, CSS practice, just like that, save it. Go back over here and call it color blue. So this is the selector. Inside of the curly braces, we're going to add the CSS properties. And right now I wrote one called color, which is going to be equal to blue. And let's open this index.html file, which is right here. So we have CSS practice. So it's an h1 tag. So it's weird that it's not selecting that. Oh, I know what happened. Need to add the following. Just like that. And then now we can refresh. As you can see, CSS practice, that h1 heading is now a color blue. So let's go back to the Visual Studio Code. We created these two files. We linked them properly because from the index.html file, we need to go into the CSS folder and get the styles.css file. That's what's happening right here. Okay, we go inside of the CSS folder and we get the styles.css file. So they're linked properly now. We selected the H1 heading just like this, and we added a property of color with the value of blue. And once we open the index.html file in our browser, we will see the styling change that we made. This is the structure with a style added of color blue. So you just wrote your first CSS rule and it actually works. So let me break down what just happened, because CSS rules have a pattern, and once you get it, everything clicks. Every CSS rule has these parts. Let's go to the styles.css file, and on the left we have the selector. This is H1 in our example. It's basically saying, hey, find all the H1 elements in our index.html file, of course. But right now there's only one. We add another one, let's say another H1. Welcome to CSS practice. You can see it's the color blue. Then there's the declaration block, which is all this I just selected. That's everything inside the curly braces. So this would be everything inside the curly braces, which this is the declaration block. Then we have the property. In this case, it's the color property, and it's what you change, which is what we gave it a color, a value of blue. We can change this to red, as you can see, the live preview on the right side. And then there's the value, right? The red color in this case, or going back to blue, okay? So you can change this to whatever you want. So you're literally we're telling the browser, find all H1 elements and make their color blue, as you can see on the right, the browser. The pattern is always selector, declaration block, property, value. So that's the pattern we're using to style. So let me give you some pro tips. Always indent your CSS properties. It looks cleaner and you'll thank me when your code gets bigger. So for example, if I'm going to write another selector, a declaration block, this does not look great. So there's no indentation. If I save it, I have settings that automatically indent for me because I'm using the prettier. I'm using this extension called Prettier code formatter for Visual Studio Code. That's why it's automatically indenting for me. But if you don't have that, you have to make sure to always indent your CSS properties. In this case, the color green, right? So if we create another heading, this one, NH2 heading, subheading example, it's going to be the color green, because we just selected it this way. But always make sure to indent your properties, be it 2 or tab. I prefer 2 spaces, okay? Another tip, save your files before refreshing the browser. I know, obvious, but we all forget. So good thing I have it right here. I have this extension called Live Preview, I think it's called. Yeah, Live Preview. So all I have to do is go to the file on the inside of the folder structure, right click and just click where it says Show Preview, right? And it's just like this. You're gonna have a browser inside of your Visual Studio Code editor. So that's why whenever I make any changes, they are live. But you don't have that. You have to save the file go into your browser. Let me do that. So double click, open my browser, and let's say I make a change, like I remove this text, and if I go back, let's say just like that, and I forget to save it, you see it stays how it was before, subheading. Remember to save the file. I know it's pretty obvious to be aware of that, but sometimes you just have to know that. Another tip, if something's not working, check for typos. CSS is picky about spelling. So let's go back to the CSS file. Say you write grown, you misspell green. This is obviously not going to work, right? Some common mistakes beginners make when they're starting to create websites using HTML and CSS are to check if you saved both files. So you may need to check if you made a change, but you forgot to save the files, right? Look for missing semicolons or brackets. So this is not right. You need to always write the semicolon at the end. You could do this and then add another property like text align center, and then you forget to write the semicolon. This will work, as you can see on the right. I haven't wrote it yet, I haven't saved anything, and it is working. So the last property and value doesn't need the semicolon, but still I suggest to always add the semicolon right after the value. Another common mistake is to make sure your file paths are right. So a mistake I made in the beginning was I forgot to add the path to the file, right? If I remove it, the styling is gone, right? It's not there anymore. So I need to go into the CSS folder and get that styles.css file. And the last common mistake is to always double check your spelling, right? If you misspell center, it's obviously not gonna work, right? If you misspell green, it's not gonna work, okay? So always make sure to check your spelling. Like I said, I'm using the live preview to be able to view the web page on the right side of my Visual Studio Code Editor, and I'm using Prettier, that extension, to format my code. So we just finished setting up a proper CSS workflow and wrote our first rule. Drop a like if this helped you out, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Until then, keep coding.